So this story that we have just read together, or stories, we could say there are two entwined together here in Matthew 9, verses 18 to 26. It could be called miracles for those in desperation. Two persons came to Jesus sort of at the end of their rope, you might say. The synagogue leader's daughter is dead, and the woman with the bleeding had been trying to get better without success for years. Mark and Matthew give longer versions of this double story, and Mark chapter 5:26 tells us, she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Both cases are ones of deep desperation. And in both cases, faith in Jesus brings help. Jesus is someone who we can trust, someone that we can look to for rescue. So that's one of the focuses of this story, faith in Jesus. There's another focus in this double story. On this Mother's Day, we're going to look a little bit deeper into something that would have struck the first people who heard this story, the people in Jesus' day. And that is Jesus' inclusion of and help for women. Now we notice things like this too. We today are conscious if someone includes women or doesn't include them. But this focus on women was even more dramatic to the first people reading and hearing this story. They would have been surprised that Jesus turned to a woman and told her, "Take heart," took notice of her need, healed her, because in that day and age, women were unfortunately more property than persons. They belonged first to their father, then to their husband. They had few legal rights. Their testimony was not recognized in court. They were not educated, very seldom. They were to learn household skills, and generally people didn't think they were capable of much more than that. Men seldom had conversation with women. I mean, why would they, since women didn't know that much and couldn't do that much? And further, people in that day and age would have been surprised that Jesus healed this girl. I mean, not only was she female, but she was still a child. And children in that generation were generally pushed away. You remember the story of Jesus and the children, the disciples were pushing them away. But Jesus said, don't forbid them from coming. Obviously, the father in this story did prize his daughter, but most people in that day did not. But we see Jesus acting against his culture. And we see that in this story as well as many times in the Gospels, Jesus overturning his culture's attitude toward women. So the text begins with a synagogue leader bowing down, basically showing his homage to Jesus, saying, "My daughter has just died, but when you would come and lay your hand on her, she would come to life again." Talk about faith in Jesus. He believes Jesus can raise his dead daughter. Interestingly, in Mark and Luke, with the fuller version of the story, the daughter dies while Jesus and the Father are en route to her house. But Matthew drops that detail. Why does he drop it? Well, writing paper was pretty precious, so you just told what you felt was essential, and Matthew basically wants to make the point that faith in Jesus conquers even death, and he wants to get right to that. The Father says, "My daughter has just died, but come and heal her." Dead, but. That's an extraordinary confidence, faith in Jesus. In verse 19, when a person comes to Jesus with this kind of confidence, dead, but something remarkable happens. It says Jesus follows. That's the word that, like Matthew has only used that word up until now for disciples following Jesus. But here, Jesus got up and followed him. Where such faith appears, Jesus follows willingly, immediately. Then verse 20 begins the intertwining story. A woman who has suffered this constant bleeding for 12 years has that same strong faith that the Father had in Jesus. Her bleeding was probably a chronic menstrual disorder. You can imagine how that would have limited her daily life that day without sanitary aids, and especially limited her in Israel, where bleeding made you and anyone that you would have contact with unclean, ritually unclean. But in her faith in Jesus, she joins this crowd that is following Jesus as he's following the synagogue leader. And she works her way closer and closer to Jesus, thinking, if I can only touch his cloak, I will be healed. And she does. Mark chapter 5, verse 30 gives the detail that Jesus felt the power go out from him. And he turned around and said, "Who touched me?" And his disciples protest. "There's people crowding all around you, and how can you ask who touched you?" Meaning she had been able to do it in a way that was not obvious. But Matthew omits that detail, those details. Perhaps because he doesn't want to be encouraging the idea that there was something magical going on, that if you just touch a particular object, it can bring healing. He wants to make clear that it's Jesus and faith in Jesus that brings the healing. So Jesus says, "Daughter, take heart. Your faith has healed you." But why does she touch the edge of the cloak? And from the specific Greek word there, it's probably referring to observant Jews would have tassels on the corners of their cloak. She touched one of the tassels. Why does she do that rather than talk to Jesus and ask him to heal her? Does she have a magical belief that touching something might heal her? All three of the gospel accounts of this story stress her decision to come up behind Jesus rather than before him, as one would ordinarily do, and her decision to touch his clothes rather than address him face to face as one ordinarily would. Probably those choices are not due to some sort of magical idea within her, but rather they came from her sensitivity and care for Jesus, wanting to spare him from interacting with a woman. Surely he doesn't really want to do that, especially a woman who is unclean. So probably her choice is prompted more by sensitivity than by superstition. And maybe her timidity in talking to, addressing Jesus is why Jesus responds, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has healed you." I said Matthew is a lot shorter. Well, there's one detail that Matthew includes that the other two don't. That Jesus said, "Take heart." The other two Gospels don't mention that. Perhaps Matthew wanted to make sure people caught that Jesus did what he could to reassure her. You don't need to be timid. You don't need to stay in the background. Now, in verse 23, we arrive at the house with the little girl. A bunch of mourners had gathered. When someone would die in this culture, even the poorest households were to hire at least 2 flute players and 1 female wailer to join with the whole neighborhood in crying over this death. When Jesus tells the mourners, "Step outside," the little girl is not dead, she's just sleeping. Now, why would Jesus say that? I mean, didn't that sort of bring some ambiguity to even confusion to the situation? Maybe Jesus said it just to see how the mourners would respond. It says they laughed at him. So now Jesus has them on record that they are sure this girl is dead. Their laughter heightens the fact of her real physical death and of this miracle. But there might be another reason why Jesus uses that word sleeping. And it's because he's going to show that death is not some frighteningly irreversible end of everything, but that it's mere sleep. And this is something that Jesus' followers picked up on again and again in the New Testament. As they're talking about someone dying, they refer to it as they slept. Because ever since Jesus, death is no longer the ultimate end of everything, but a mere sleep from which we awaken to a new day. Amazing. Verse 25, when the crowd had been put outside, Jesus went into the girl's room, took hold of her hand, and the little girl was raised from the dead. Mark chapter 5 says, immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around, and they were completely astonished. They just sat there being astonished, and Jesus said, give her something to eat. Again, we see Jesus' care for this little girl. And again, we see that faith in Jesus is vindicated even faith that Jesus is stronger than death. On this Mother's Day now, I want to spend the rest of our time together celebrating the fact that Jesus shows care for women, for girls. Care and compassion gives them value. And I want us to celebrate that Jesus' attitude affected the church's attitude, which eventually affected the world's attitude toward women, toward girls. The church grew amazingly rapidly. 300 years after Jesus, half the population of the Roman Empire would have identified themselves as Christians. The stats are that it grew 50% every decade, which is just a phenomenal rate of growth. And even more phenomenal, during this time, travel was difficult, communication was difficult. There were no modern communications. There were no church buildings because persons were persecuted. They were killed for being a Christian. And the church grew so much. Well, one of the reasons the early church grew, this is sociologists, not necessarily those who are believers, but those who want to figure out, how the church grew. Those who are not believers are looking for sort of natural reasons. And one of the natural reasons is that women were drawn to the church. Historians estimate that in Rome there were about 130 men for every 100 women. And that's because their method of birth control was infanticide, and infant girls were typically the ones that were exposed, left to die, because women were not valued as much. But in the church, that ratio flipped. There were 130 women for every 100 men. One historian, Rodney Stark, one of these not writing, he's a Christian now, but he was an agnostic at this point. He wondered why all women didn't become Christians, because Jesus and the church again and again boosted, augmented the life experience of women. For instance, they gave women much higher status than the Greco-Roman society did. Paul greets in his letters many women whom he calls his co-workers. He talked of women prophesying. He calls a woman an apostle. And then Jesus, he commissioned Mary Magdalene to tell his disciples, the apostles, about his resurrection. He affirmed Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, in sitting with the disciples and being taught by him. He had many lengthy conversations with women. With the woman at the well, he revealed for the first time to anybody that he was the Messiah. Women in the Christian community enjoyed much higher status than what they did among their pagan neighbors. Rodney Stark gives this stat. There was a study of 3,733 Christian burials in the catacombs. That's a network of caves under Rome. And they found that Christian women were nearly as likely as Christian men to be commemorated with lengthy inscriptions. Stark says, this near equality in the commemoration of males and females is something that is peculiar to Christians and sets them apart from the non-Christian populations of the city. Another way that women benefited from Christianity is that Jesus and the Apostle Paul gave a dignity to singleness. Women were not simply prized for their childbearing. They were prized as persons with their gifts, with their faith, with their service for Jesus. And even more, Jesus and Paul said that men must be as restrained in their sexuality as women had always been expected to be. And historians say that made a huge difference in the quality of life for women. This call for strict lifelong monogamy within marriage. Kyle Harper, he's an oft-cited historian of that historical era, writing today. He's written the book on slavery in the first century. And he's also written one on sexuality. And he calls this the church's emphasis on monogamy the original sexual revolution. When we think of sexual revolution that changed the world, we think of the 1960s. But Harper says the most significant, most influential revolution in sexual values was in the first century. In the 1960s, people said, women, you can be as sexually unconstrained as men have always been. But in the church, in the first century, the church said, men, you must be as constrained, as restricted as women have always been. They were following Jesus, who not only taught against immorality, but also said, don't even look with lust. Said, be faithful to your marriage vows. What God has joined together, let no one separate. And that was new in that culture. Here's how new it was for the Roman society. In Latin, there was not a word for adult male virgin. There was not a word. And they had 25 words for prostitute. It was expected that a freeborn Roman male would casually exploit the bodies of anyone lower than him as if they were non-persons. What we would call exploitation or abuse, his culture considered perfectly appropriate. The church's insistence on faithful monogamy was revolutionary in how it channeled men into their family, into their wives, making women and girls more secure, more safe. It gave them dignity. They were treated better, as well as it gave them protection. We so often hear the failings of the church, and they are real. Many times through church history, the church does not act like Jesus. The church many times did not value women, but Jesus did, and he moved his followers in many ways in that direction too. And why did people follow Jesus? Why did they let him move them in a certain direction or not? Was it because, they said, aha, Jesus has this enlightened social ethic. We should really follow him because of what it will do to transform the value of women and society. Unfortunately, not many people are that perceptive. No, they follow Jesus because of their faith in him. Miracles like in our text teach that Jesus' power, Jesus' love is there as we come to him. And it's even limitless. There is Nothing, absolutely nothing that can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Not our sin, not our sickness, not even death, that last great enemy. And then once we follow Jesus, because of our faith, all these other things come too and fall into place. One of the fun, actually haven't read the book yet, but I've listened to lots of podcasts. The Air We Breathe, Glenn Scrivener, talking about all these values, all these things that we today in our modern culture value that come from Jesus. They're not self-evident. They're something that comes from Jesus. As people have faith in Jesus and they follow Jesus, they let their life be led and shaped by the example of Jesus. There are all these amazingly important, lifted up values that come